ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Italian Cultural Institute. I'm a little in a difficult position. Let me start by making a confession. I admit that when Riccardo Viale asked me to present the welcoming remarks at the seminar titled Bounded Rationality Updated, I had a moment of hesitation because I didn't have the faintest idea of what the discussion was about. To me, bounded rationality updated sounded more or less like Matrix Reloaded or something like that. Probably I had been out of the academic circuits for too long. Therefore, before answering the request of the Italian Cultural Institute, I made my research and I came across the familiar name of Herbert Simon. Moreover, the title of Joseph Stiglitz's contribution, Rethinking Macroeconomics, What Went Wrong and How to Fix It, brought to mind my studies in economics, and in particular the theme of my dissertation in 1981, very far ago, investment decisions in imperfect markets. I recalled my discussion at the time with my fellow young economists who were of the type, is it rational to have rational expectations? Which is exactly the title of Alan Kierman's lecture in the program of tomorrow. So once reassured by a more familiar framework, I can now say that I'm very happy that Professor Viale decided to host this symposium together and in collaboration with the Italian Academy of Columbia University. How people make decisions and try to solve problems is really a very fascinating field of study. As fascinating is also the story of Herbert Simon, who is at the origin of the concepts of artificial intelligence or cognitive psychology. He did what I wanted to do with my friends at the University of Pisa at the time, which means use mathematics to make social sciences more rigorous, only to discover that, nevertheless, there is something missing when human factors are translated into numbers. But Professor Simon went beyond that, because you can still use computers, if not mathematics, to study how the thinking process works. So Herbert Simon received, among many other honors, the Nobel Prize in Economics. I'm wondering if, as a diplomat, striving to apply this approach to international relations, I have any chance to be awarded one day the Nobel Peace Prize. In any case, it is not my intention to subtract time to the real experts of tonight. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank Massimo Egidi and Katherine Simon Frank for being here with us tonight. And I'm looking forward to listening to Gerd Gigerenzer's lecture and learn more about why biased minds make better inferences, which I'm sure it will be very inspiring for all of us. Enjoy the lecture and these 3 days of social sciences culture in the framework of the first Herbert Simon Society Conference in New York.
I think that when we have to introduce, to speak about Herbert Simon, obviously you cannot know where to begin. If, for example, we analyze some different variegated fields, for example, economics, theory organization, management, political science, cognitive psychology, computer science, logic, philosophy of science, normally it's very difficult to find some common denominator among some variegated fields. Are different goal, different methodology, different topic. But there is one common denominator, and the common denominator is Herbert Simon, because Herbert Simon in each of these fields make important contribution, and his work range over so many fields that it seems in the past unlikely that the same man would be so universal to cope with so many different topics. And after some years, I remember that some of his colleagues find a kind of ideal type of Herbert Simon, an abstract universal entity that was called Herb. Because Herbert Simon was too human. They were calling Herb for something less human because it was so universal in his kind of spectrum of analysis. Herbert Simon, as you know, received a lot of awards, the Alan Turing Award for Computer Science, the National Medal for Science, the von Neumann Theory Prize for Operational Research, and the Nobel Prize for Economics. We can say many are saying that it was one of the most important scientists of the 20th century, and probably the most important scientist in social science of the 20th century. And I add, the best Renaissance scientist of the 20th century, someone that was able to cover so many aspects of the knowledge. Many of us had a great depth toward Herbert Simon all around the world. My first I began to meet Simon in a we can say kind of marginal field for Simon's work. It was a philosophy of science, and not so marginal the computer simulation of scientific discovery, but particularly in philosophy of science, I remember when I was completely out-fashioned to support Simon's thesis against the Popperian separation of the context of discovery and context of justification. And he was completely alone in that time to support this thesis. And after, also, I am in depth with Simon with the obviously strong boundary rationality theory as a tool for me to try to argument against the holistic structuralism in social science from one side and the hermeneutic approach in social science on the opposite side. In any case, I think in Italy many of scholars were influenced directly or indirectly with awareness, without awareness, by Herbert Simon. And this, in particular in computer simulation, in economics, in cognitive psychology. And this explains why in 2001, when unexpectedly Simon died, after some time, remember 1 year, a group of scholars decided to give birth to Herbert Simon Society, involving many other persons around the world. I don't want to cover this to focus on the Herbert Simon Society mission, because Massimo Egidi, the president of Herbert Simon Society, will tell some word about this. What I want to say that today we are here for the first conference on Herbert Simon Society. the title is Boundary Rationality. 2 years ago, we had a preparatory workshop on boundary rationality here in New York, organized by Italian Cultural Institute, that saw the participation of many distinguished scholars. There was Darian Kahneman, Jon Elster, Dan Sperber, Colin Kammerer, Sidney Winter, Richard Nelson, Edward Feigenbaum, Roy Gardner, Massimo Egidi, and Giovanni Dosi, and many others. Today, the first conference, the first honorary lecture will be held by Gerd Gigerenzer. I think this choice is not neutral, it's not casual. Why is not casual? Because there are two ways to conceive the boundary rationality theory. One way, that is a way was dominant in the workshop 2 years ago, is the way in which boundary rationality theory is about the limitation of human mind in producing correct reasoning and decision making. The limitation of human mind, if we use the metaphor of Simon, the scissor, the blade, one blade that is the limited mind, and the second blade that is the environmental complexity, are so far and so distant that the scissor can't cut. Then, in this case, the boundary rationality theory program means, or research means, to study bias, error, traps that show how much the decision-making reasoning processes of the man is suboptimal and is distant from canonic prescription. And this is one of the concept of boundary rationality theory. The second concept of boundary rationality theory, instead, has a different view. Starting from the metaphor of scissor, this concept, this theory, say the limitation of mind and the first blade is not really a limitation, is a feature of the human mind that with the complexity of the environment, the second blade allow the scissor to cut, and sometimes to cut better than when the one blade is represented by unlimited mind. Then this kind of approach obviously changed completely the target of empirical research. The research become mainly to show how much the human mind is able to to give ecological, rational answer in many contexts of the real life, and how much this kind of answer or this mind of decision are sometimes better than decision taken according to canonic rule of probabilistic calculus or deductive calculus and so on. Then from this point of view, obviously, is completely different, the approach. But what is important in this approach of boundary rationality, that this is more inclusive for many other fields of research. For example, for this approach, intuition and emotion are not annoying disturbance phenomenon that distort the optimal process of the human mind, but are instead, on the opposite, are features that increase the adaptive fitness and skill of the human mind to cope with ecological situation and to give ecological rational answer. Also from this point of view, is the mind is not something detached from biological evolution. Instead, we open the door to evolutionary psychology to give us some understanding of the tools, for example, some kind of heuristics that allow in the past species before us to cope with environment. And lastly, also is much more easy to integrate the neurobiological study about mind, brain, and behavior inside this approach in boundary rationality than the first approach. Then I concluded. This explains why it's not casual that the first Herbert Simon honorary lecture is held by Gerd Gigerenzer, because Gerd Gigerenzer represents for me the most important diciamo, follower of this kind of boundary rationality interpretation that, according to me, is more coherent to what Herbert Simon wanted to do about human behavior. Thank you very much, and now I call on Massimo Egidi to give the welcoming remarks. Thank you.
This society has been created a few years ago by a group of Italian economists and American economists, including myself. All this person, we had in the past the opportunity to scientifically collaborate with Herb Simon and to enjoy his very, very warm friendship in an atmosphere that in past was really an atmosphere of intellectual affinity, and an atmosphere in which many emerging ideas were developed all together with Herb Simon, or under the, let's say, the Herb Simon help and support. He was warmly encouraging all the research I was calling before. And as he did, our main task, the task of this organization and this society, is to support young people, young researchers, and help them to open their mind and to follow the large number of scientific research areas that spread from Simon intellectual achievement, a very large, incredibly large areas, and Viale says something about that, so I don't want to add anything. Anyway, I believe that it's important to maintain the spirit of Herbert Simon, the spirit with which he developed the most important intellectual innovation, the spirit of curiosity, intellectual courage. This is not, it's quite rare, the intellectual courage. The art of, let's say, eliciting new ideas based on the reality, based on the real world. That was, I believe, one of the most important aspects of Herb Simon. All Simon intellectual innovation were deeply supported by facts and data coming from the experience. In an essay written in December 2000 for the Italian business newspaper Il Sole 24 Ore, Simon urged economists to conduct profound revision of economic theories and to move toward a new, richer and realistic view of the human activities within the economic institution. I quote him, I cite him, "All of the direction I shall mention are concerned with meeting economics' deep need to build strong and empirically based connection, which today are fatally weak, between economic theory and the real phenomena of the world of business, consumer activity, and government." And I remember personally many situations in which was saying to the researchers, saying to the group attending to a seminar, look at the world, look at the real world, what happens in the reality. So let me very briefly say 2 or 3 points about what I believe, quite personally, it's a very important heritage that we have. There are many other, but just in my personal interpretation. One point is, in a few minutes, of course, and one point is the epistemological breakthrough. Riccardo Viale tells something about that. Fundamentally, the point is that you have to remember the years in which Herb Simon started with his most important papers and books, the 50s. In the 50s, the standard idea was a normative interpretation of the theory of choice. Theory of choice in decision-making was considered, like in the original paper of Lyon Robbins, a fundamental science of choice, a normative science of choice. In this approach, fundamentally, calculation is totally independent from individual mental activities. Nothing to do with the psychological aspect of the mental activities. And it's even irrespective of the mental processes of the individuals. The role of rational decision-making was viewed in that way, and was a normal view, a normal consideration. So Simon was starting in a very difficult, to some extent, situation in which the domination of this approach was anyway related only to the market analysis, the micro approach to the market analysis, no idea about rationality within organization. So rationality within organization was born in the Simon idea, but was not the typical, the traditional rationality. Milton Friedman at that time was one of the strongest advocates of the normative approach. What was the strong, let's say, justification of this approach? He was claiming that behavior of consumer, firms, and investors can be described as if they behave rationally. The Friedman hypothesis, stating that non-rational agent will not survive evolutionary competition and will therefore be driven out from the market because they was not supposed to be optimal or the best. In a similar spirit, Alkian in that years argued that biological evolution and natural selection driven by profits may eliminate non-rational, non-optimizing firms and lead to a market where rational profit maximizing firms dominate. That's not true. And that has been clearly explained by 2, 3 important authors, and the most important in my view are, of course, Nelson and Winter, who was just putting seriously the question into attention, because the idea was that it's possible to show that it's not true that if you let the market to move autonomously, firms or organization of individual achieve automatically the best solution, the Pareto optimal solution. There are many situations in which people can be locked in, firms are locked in very suboptimal solution, and they stay there without being able to jump up and to increase the quality of the situation. And that has been discussed and developed by, after Nelson and Winter, many other authors, and also authors in a very traditional area, which is the area of game theoretical approach. Because we have, for example, the 2 or 3 examples of experiment on game theories and game theoretical with game theoretical approach applied to organization, in which it's very simple to show that when there are many equilibria, many Nash equilibria, you can be locked in one very suboptimal equilibrium and not be able to move up and to jump up to the optimal position. So this approach was completely reversed. It was not possible at this point to claim that doesn't have any importance if people are not rational. They become rational just because they learn from the market what they have to do in order to become rational. This approach is changed radically from this reaction, because in that way people cannot learn to become the best and the most rational. They learn something. They learn something which is, let's say, to some extent, limited rationality. So this has been, I believe, a starting point of very, very important movement of ideas. And at the same time, in the 50s, just to remember to you, there was the Allais contribution in which he was showing that the theory of rationality was not fulfilling the human behavior was not fulfilling a theory of rationality. And that has been a very, very, very important contribution. But if you check the development of this idea, you see that the larger part of the activity of a researcher who moved from this starting point, at least for 20 years, was simply to try to modify the original theoretical approach, modify some axiom of the original theoretical approach, while the real strong intervention of Simon has been to change the way by which you was supposed to consider rationality. You do not have to add or modify 2 or 3 actions to the theory of rationality. You have to understand what are the fundamental psychological, cognitive roots for producing a rational or a bounded rational behavior. So that has been a sort of 2 paths during 30 years. On the one hand, the traditional creation of, it's similar to Viale conclusion to some extent. The traditional route in which people are supposed to, let's say, to behave in a way which is not perfectly fitting with the theory of rationality, so we change some axiom, we modify slightly something, but again and again they do not behave in the way that we are supposed they would made. And so the other route has been change your mind, introduce the idea of problem solving, introduce the idea of using as fundamental a realistic analysis of the human being as thinking, reasoning, and so forth. So just to add very few points. I believe that a second very important point in Simon has been the idea of changes of representation. Also, I believe that in the today's presentation we will move to this topic. In Simon's view, the question is that in the science of artificial, he says that suggests that all problem solving may be viewed as changes in representation. That solving a problem can be seen as representing it so that the solution becomes transparent, clear. That comes from Polya, if somebody knows this mathematician, who invented also, together with Simon, in my view, the idea of heuristics. So the point is, it's really easy to change representation. I believe that a large part of what is moving in the intellectual arena around this problem in the last 20 years has been to show that it's very difficult to transfer the skill from one representation to another one representation. The question is, as in experiment that Gigerenzer has developed in the last years, that you can, starting from Wason effect, that you can start from a very abstract problem. In this representation, very few people are able to solve the problem that are submitted to them, while if you go in a different representation, a large part of people are able to do that, depending upon the context that has been created around them. Depending upon that context, they may find a great effort or a minimal effort to solve them. So that's the second, I believe, great idea in which Herb Simon developed the original problem-solving approach. Finally, I believe that one more point that will be developed in the afternoon, I believe, is dualism in the organization. The dualism in the human being, the dual approach of reasoning, the idea developed by many psychologues that people has 2 competing, let's say, reasoning mechanisms, and on the other hand, the dualism in the organization. That has been a very important idea developed in the organization with Jim March. I don't know what are the relations. So far, it's not so clear what are the micro foundation of the idea of organizational behavior, the dualism in the organizational behavior between routine on the one hand and the innovation, because that was the idea, the Simon idea. And it was an idea which was coming from the reality, from the analysis of the real organization, practical organization. But it's possible or it's not possible, that's a question that I'm not able to respond to, let's say, to try to find the roots of this differentiation between, let's say, routine behavior and innovative behavior into into the dualism of human mind. That's, I believe, is a question that is not so easy to be solved, and in the last years, some of the researchers have tried to solve without any clear outcome. Finally, I believe that one final important aspect of the story is, in my view, rational expectation. Rational expectation was born in the 50s, in the same arena in which Herb Simon was working. At the Graduate School of Industrial Administration of Calgary, Maryland, there was people like Charles Holt, Franco Modigliani, and John Mute. Curiously, the two ideas, rational expectation on the one hand and bounded rationality on the other, originated in the same context in the same groups, at the reply, the answer to the same problem in a very different way. And my personal idea is that after the disaster that we have had from the application of rational expectation theory to the macroeconomic approach, possibly we have to move back to another approach in which the differentiation of the different human behaviors has a real basic explanation in terms of psychological approach. Many people are moving in that direction, which is the micro foundation, new micro foundation of macroeconomics. And I believe that, like, for example, Carl Holmes and many others, and in my view, this is a most intriguing and not solved problem for the future. Will be possible to move out from the rational expectation model, who seems not to take into account the real human behavior, and found out new fundamentals about that. Okay, just to conclude, my impression has been that at least one or three important points has been completely changed in the last 50 years. Fundamentally, the first one that I was saying before, and moreover, the new idea that now human beings are important in order to understand how the market is working, the organization are working. It's not possible to say that you have a model that does not take into account human beings and their rational, limited rational, or else irrational behaviors. So we know that the models of bounded rationality now are possible, are workable, and are fundamentally the most important route for the future of the economy. Thank you.
Yes, I did have the privilege of growing up with my father and knew him for 60 years. And so I'm here not as an expert on Herbert Simon, the scientist, or the he wasn't an economist, he was a political scientist, actually, by training and by education, and he learned mathematics, and then he learned computers, and so he worked really not so much in the fields in which he was educated, but rather in his adopted fields, which he came to love very much. So my remarks tonight really are more sort of biographical of him, some stories about him that might help explain him as a human being. You may know him by reputation. Many of you may have met him. I hope you had a chance to do that. So I wanted to welcome you tonight to this first international conference of the Herbert Simon Society. And thank you also for inviting me to be part of this gathering. It means a lot to me. And for those of you who are here attending the conference, thanks for attending the conference. I feel privileged both to be able to share these remarks about my father and also to be here to hear your presentations on the current research that has grown out of his work and the work of others in the early period. Sometimes his ideas were a little bit ahead of their time, and sometimes he built on the work of others and interpreted these complex notions in ways that others could build on. One thing is clear: what work my father did, he loved, and the most exciting part is that work continues to interest and motivate and stimulate scholars like you in the academic world and in the wider setting where these ideas can be put to practical use. I have to first explain, I'm a little nervous, but being in front of you makes me feel a little bit like I did as a child when friends in school said to me, asked me why my father was always being in the newspaper and why his name was known. And I saw him always just as a dad. He wasn't a famous person to me. He wasn't unusual at all to me. He did the same kinds of things that dads did with all of their kids. And even over the years, as he became better and better known, he still was very attentive to his family. So I was always amazed that people were curious about him, and all I could say was he was a professor. I didn't understand why his ideas were in the newspaper. But one reporter did find me and asked me in the course of the conversation, what is it like to have a famous father? And I truly didn't know the answer. I didn't understand his question. I was speechless. And I finally said to him, I don't understand your question. He was just my dad. And that left the reporter speechless. Around the time I was preparing this introduction, and I was asked actually to talk about Herbert Simon, the man and the scientist, and I didn't know him as a scientist. I happened to be in Menards, which is a large, maybe you have Menards here, but it's a large hardware store basically. I needed to purchase locks for my house, a front door and a back door. And I first went to look in that section and found two very wide aisles, very long aisles, full of locks and handles and doorknobs. And there were locks made by a dozen manufacturers in 5 different finishes, and who knows how many doorknobs and handles there were. But in less than 5 minutes, I actually chose a set of knobs and locks for both my front and back doors. And while I waited and I did it without thinking much about it, but while I waited for the locks to be keyed to each other, I realized that my ability to make my choice so quickly was because of what my father taught me. And this all happened at the time I was starting to think about this talk. Understanding decision-making and knowing how to make decisions was a gift my father gave to me. Perhaps he modeled this for some of you as well. Part of getting good at making decisions involves being able to accept the consequences of the decisions we make and knowing that we make the best choices we can. This exercise is an example of satisficing, my father always used to say. And satisficing requires one to set up, and this is my interpretation of it, it may not be the scientific definition, but satisficing requires one to set up criteria for the eventual outcome, and with that as a limitation, to make the choice from just those things that meet the criteria. So this process of buying the doorknobs and locks goes as follows. First, I needed hardware for the front door that needed to present a good face to the public. The hardware for the back door could be more modest, since I was likely to be the only one to see it. The second, I liked a particular I liked a particular shape of the knob because of the character and age of the house. Third, I knew I wanted knobs instead of a lever for the door. Fourth, I knew I had to have a deadbolt to meet my community's code. And fifth, I knew the color of the front and back doors, and I wanted the hardware finish to look good against those first surfaces. And finally, I had decided to choose from one lock company, which I actually knew from past experience to be reliable. So there I had it, 6 criteria to apply as I looked over the shelves and shelves and shelves of handles and knobs and locks. Thus, I reduced the overwhelming task of choosing from nearly 100 options to just a few, and voila, my job was done. If I hadn't followed this process, I might still be wondering which lock set to buy. As I continued to wait for the new keys, I wondered what other characteristics I take for granted that in fact I learned from my father's wisdom, and I started to think about things that I know and remember, things that have influenced my life from the time I was very young. For one thing, Herbert Simon was a very good listener and very compassionate. He didn't like to tell people what to do, or at least he didn't appear to. And once, when I was 19, I had a serious problem that I was concerned about, and I went to talk to him about it. After I shared the situation, he quietly and simply said to me, "I know you'll make a good decision." Well, his response utterly stunned me because what I was looking for was advice from my dad. I wanted him to tell me what to do. And it appeared he was brushing me off, which didn't sit very well with me. So I was very, very angry for a while. But when I calmed down, I realized that he'd given me the power to empower myself. And he'd respected me so much that he trusted me with my own decision-making ability. He'd left it to me to determine my own fate. And that's really scary, but it's tremendously powerful. And I hope there's one person in this room that he did the same to. I've never forgotten that lesson. I apply it now for myself and also with others. In so many ways, I saw him do this same procedure with other people in the family and with his students. Herbert listened to the family and friends, but he also listened to strangers. This was one of the ways he learned. When he traveled by air, he made a point of engaging in conversations with his seatmate on the airplane. By asking simple questions, he'd get the person talking about themselves. If the conversation lagged and the seatmate asked Herbert about himself, he'd answer briefly, modestly, and in very general terms. Then he'd turn the conversation back onto the seatmate. By the end of the trip, he'd often have the seatmate convinced that he had the same occupation as they did, because by listening closely, he'd pick up the person's jargon, and so he could ask more questions that sounded like he knew more than he did. But by the end of the trip, he did know more than he had known at the beginning of the conversation, and when he came home, he'd talk excitedly about what he'd learned from that person, and he felt the richer for the new knowledge. So I think everybody he came into contact with, he learned something from. Another example of how Herbert negotiated his world, he wasn't much for working out, physically working out, getting exercise, but he did love to walk and hike. Instead of going to the gym every day, he walked the mile from home to his office on the Carnegie Mellon campus, and at the end of the day, home again. Living 1 mile from campus was not an accident. In 1949, when he and my mother decided to move to Pittsburgh from Chicago, they went and looked for houses and told the realtor that they wanted a map. And so they got a map and they plotted out where Baker Hall on the campus of Carnegie Mellon was sited, and they put a pin in the map and attached a string that was the length, the equivalent of a mile on the scale of the map to that pin, and drew, as they circled the string around the pin, they drew a circle which was a mile in radius from that office. And they told the realtor they would only look at houses in that circle. And they found a wonderful house, which was the one we lived in on Northumberland Street. So besides this reassuring his exercise regime, this made sure that he was going to walk a mile every day. This seemed to be another example of satisficing. One had to get to work every day. One is advised to get exercise every day. And so to optimize the situation and combine the two tasks, live a mile from your workplace. Years after moving to Pittsburgh, one day as he walked, he was calculating, just thinking. I mean, that was very good thinking time for him. And sometimes as I got older, it was a special time to walk with him from home down to the Carnegie Mellon campus. But it was a good thinking time for him. That particular day, he calculated how many miles he had walked on Northumberland Street. And he figured that he must have been the only person on earth who'd ever walked 1 million miles on that particular street. And he chuckled at that idea. He chuckled about many things. Many of you who know him would know that he had a very good sense of humor. And he found funny things even in moments of life's hard moments. He loved to laugh, and he believed that laughter made the world a better place. At the same time, he loved words, and within the family, we often played games with words and usually ended up laughing uproariously. We just had a very good time together. But by associating words with having fun, my father indirectly instilled in us the love of reading and writing. And speaking of teaching, I mean, all these little examples are teaching, but not in very overt ways. Herbert was a wonderful teacher. He was formerly a teacher who was paid to teach as well as his research. And part of his philosophy was that people learn best by doing rather than by sitting at the feet of another. He also believed that if a person knows how to ask questions, they'll learn. Therefore, he liked to help people learn to ask questions about anything and everything. The more inquisitive a person is, the easier it is for that person to become learned. So he challenged his students, beginning with the first day of class, to ask questions that would lead to answers. Sometimes he would walk into the classroom, tell his students to begin to ask questions about the subject matter, and they knew nothing, and they expected him to be up there lecturing. They were totally muddled, and then he would, after he stated this, that they should come up with the questions for the course, he would walk out of the room and ask, and with the direction that they should come to his office when they had some questions to ask him. And from that, the course grew. So he challenged his students, and the students all began to ask themselves questions and talk to each other and their other teachers and other resources, and then they began to collaborate with each other. And as they did this, they began to understand what it was they were seeking to learn. So you might say that his most effective teaching technique was to engage in dialogue with his students, but not just individually, but also in groups. But individually, he employed an additional tool, and that was debate. Not only his students, but his children and his friends knew all too well what it was to debate with Herbert. On almost any topic you can imagine, Herbert would raise a question, or he'd take your own question. He would ask another question or two of his own to determine which side you were on, of the debate you were on, and then he'd take the opposite side, and the debate would begin. He'd push stridently through the question at hand. Eventually, he'd stop and look at you in the eye, and you knew the debate was over. I remember well his congratulations that followed. Congratulations about the good arguments I had presented and the good questions I'd asked. And then he'd admit to playing the devil's advocate, debating for the sake of debating. And I have to say that although it's very good training for debating, it's very exasperating because one wants to maybe not be challenged so much all the time, but it was a very good way of just exploring ideas deeply with Herbert. It taught me to learn to hold my own with my opinion because I'm not getting cowed by the fact that someone had a different opinion. Famous people are held in esteem, they're treated with kid gloves, they're sort of held above everybody else. People talk to you, but there's not a personal engagement in the same way. And he loved coming home from trips because he felt he was back in his genuine environment. And I never understood this quite so deeply as after he died and I met the people who knew him, some of whom I hadn't known because I had been grown up and living away from home for a number of years. But I was stunned to find out how many people felt so deeply connected to him. And it was because they had known him as a human being with all of his humanness and not this holding him up on a pedestal. And I hope you'll think about that as you continue in this conference and really think about him and how he lived what he taught and lived what he believed. And I'll tell you one last story, sort of maybe the only real story about how my father taught me about economics that I have. It was, he didn't formally teach us things like that, but this particular, am I doing that? Is that? Okay. When the main thing, this main lesson had nothing to do with money, actually. It had everything to do with social capital. As he explained it, we're all born with a certain set of points, number of points. I later learned that points at birth are determined by one's race, gender, family's socioeconomic status, prettiness, inborn demeanor, and so on. These are some things we have no control over. As we grow, we develop characteristics, and we... Thank you. As we grow, we develop characteristics and we behave in particular ways. He explained we can earn points by good behavior, by being funny, by being sweet, or being smart, by saying something insightful. We can lose points when we misbehave and do bad deeds. Sometimes as I grew up, he'd remark, "That earned you some points," or "Be careful, you'll lose points that way." This technique certainly worked as a parental control, but it also left a lot to my own determination. I could have surplus points, or I could behave otherwise and maintain a low balance of points. My father was quick to point out that one could do the occasional eccentric thing, be outspoken, hold an unpopular belief, if one had a surplus of points. The fewer the points, the more careful one had to be not to offend others and not to hold unusual or unpopular opinions. So I know that my father would have loved to be here. I just see if I think I know my father would have loved to be here at this conference and to speak with you, meet with you who are grappling with the kinds of concepts he studied. He would have been so glad to know that his life's work made a difference and that it is still making a difference. So thank you all for attending this conference, and now I want to pass the podium on to the next part of the program.
4 years after he died, Herbert Simon looked back to what had happened to his program of bounded rationality. He wondered why his call for realism in the study of decision-making was received with so little passion, and why so many didn't want to listen. In his own words, the study of bounded rationality was received with, I quote, "something less than unbounded enthusiasm," if not largely ignored as irrelevant by economists, and as probably wrong for many years. Yes, one should say there were a few formal models of satisficing and other heuristics by Selton, Luce, Tversky, Payne, Bettman, Johnson, and others, but even worse than ignored. Herbert Simon's bounded rationality became used, the name became used for quite different philosophies. Optimization under constraints, and its opposite, deviations from optimization. So, Herbert Simon is a man whose thought and thinking developed over all the years. So there are many Herbert Simons, there's not one. And I'll try to do my best to explain what bounded rationality meant for him. I think that's the most concise definition that he gave. It's the question about how do human beings reasoning when the conditions for rationality postulated by the model of neoclassical economics are not met. What does that mean? It means, in other words, these are situations where not all alternatives are known, not all consequences are known, and not all probabilities are known. Short. Where by definition one cannot optimize. And that's maybe part of the answer to our chairperson's question, namely, why had Herbert Simon so little influence on his mother discipline, economics? And if there's one answer is, because to answer his questions you need to go beyond optimization. And that's that's not the only mathematical framework. There's much more mathematics than optimization. So, the bounded rationality in Herbert Simon's sense is much more close to what Frank Knight called uncertainty, as opposed to known risks. And Simon apparently arrived at this program after trying to apply what he learned at the University of Chicago, utility maximization, to budget decision-making in organizations. In his own words, I quote, "I realized that this framework was hopeless. End of quote. My own point of view is that I think very similar to Herbert Simon, there are problems where we can maximize, where we have good data, and it's usually problems that are well defined and simple. But for most of the important problems we face, the assumptions for optimization are not given. So, whom should you marry? What job to take? What to do with the rest of your life? Try to optimize. Good luck. But we can do different things. And one of the heuristics that Herbert Simon is most well known for is satisficing. Satisficing he used in two different ways. One is a big program as opposed to optimizing. The other one is a very precise heuristic. And one can use satisficing for hardware shopping, as we just learned. But one can use it for other problems. For instance, one of my doctoral students worked out how BMW dealers price their used cars. And Florian Artinger found what they do, they satisfy. So they set an aspiration level. Wait if a customer comes who is willing to pay. If not, after 4 weeks, lower the price by 5% or so. Wait another 4 weeks, lower the price, and so on. That's satisfying with a kind of moving aspiration level. Why don't they try to optimize? Because they can't. They don't know. You can always make up a model, a very nice one, but this is what real BMW dealers do. There are a few, but very few, like a 1%, who try to do one kind of optimization procedure to look at all the comparable cars and price an iota below everyone. Yeah, but it's not sure whether that makes more money. I don't think so. The two key essential parts of bounded rationality in Herbert Simon's sense are here. When you study rational behavior or behavior of people, make process models, not as-if models. And I will get to this. Second, study situations where decision-making is under uncertainty, where not everything is known or knowable, not just under risk. And these are, I think, the two basic defining features. If you think that most psychologists make process model, that's not the case. Economists rarely make process models, but even in psychology, his call for making models how people actually make decisions is a revolution, and still one. What I will do now first is to explain why I said bounded rationality has been, the name has been used for at least 3 completely different programs. And the first one is optimization under constraints. So most economists would say bounded rationality is what Ken Arrow thought. And interestingly, he wrote that in the memorial volume for Herbert Simon, basically saying bounded rationality is nothing than optimization in disguise. This is not what Herbert Simon thought. He explicitly, I quote him, said, "The study of bounded rationality is not the study of optimization in relation to task environments. And only in a very simple case you can optimize." In personal conversation, he once told me that he wanted to sue people who misuse his term for optimization under constraints. He didn't. And maybe because he was an honest man and found a little guilt in his own writings that very early actually had optimization models for satisficing. But every genius should be granted a development. So that's not what a bounded rationality is. Then, interestingly, most psychologists think about bounded rationality as something like the opposite, as the study of human errors, or, put it plainly, irrationality. That looks like diametrically opposed to optimization under constraints, so constrained rationality, and kind of human stupidity, but it isn't. The study of cognitive illusions takes optimization as granted and studies how people deviate. So it's again optimization. And here's a quotation from Danny Kahneman, who uses this meaning of bounded rationality and in earlier work attributes it to Herbert Simon. I don't know. Herb emphasized that the Kahneman-Tversky work was important for him to fight the neoclassical economists. But that doesn't mean that this is his program of bounded rationality. That should not be confused. There is a third vision, the vision that I and Reinhard Selten and our research group in Berlin adhere to, namely taking these two features. So bounded rationality describe how a judgment and decision is reached, not as if, but try to make process models, and also to describe the environment. We heard before the scissors metaphor, I'll get to this, the environment in which such a strategy succeeds. And there's no need that there's an optimization algorithm out there. And I think that also economics would get richer if they would dare to get rid of this straitjacket of optimization. Optimization has its use, as I said, for a certain limited number of problems, but it's often, as many, and some psychologists included, try to fulfill the old Leibnizian dream of one general calculus, one tool for every problem. Be it expected utility maximization, be it Bayesians, and as it was. Leibniz didn't find this calculus, and he was one of the smartest men on earth. And I personally think, in terms of an adaptive toolbox. So we have more tools. Not everything is a nail, and we have a hammer. Some things are screws, and it's not a good idea to use a hammer. So I will talk today about this program where the human being is labeled here a Homo Heuristicus. So a person who tries to get along with heuristics. What is a heuristic? In general, a heuristic is a rule that ignores part of the information. For instance, just as you didn't check every piece in the hardware store, but tried to get something that is both fast and frugal, but also highly efficient. So let me start with the opposite, with the as-if program. I guess I have a mixed audience here today, so I'll try to talk at a level so that most of you understand most things. Easier. Peggy says easier, okay? First, I have to confront you with the Friedman conjecture. Sorry, but that's part of economics. So the Friedman, and also Savage, proposed a very interesting analogy how economics would go. And the basic idea is this: think about a billiard player. And the billiard player, although he may not do all these things, we could say he behaves as if he would do all these calculations. And then we know where the ball is going. That has become the kind of fruit fly for many of economic thinking. So it's enough to do as-if models. And the as-if models are not arbitrary. They follow a convenient type of mathematics. That's what we want, and we'll think that people behave as if. So now I invite you into a thought experiment. Assume that Milton Friedman, would have not chosen billiard, but baseball. how does a baseball player know where to run when a fly ball is coming in high? Now, we could make the as-if argument, and actually, Richard Dawkins did it. So he says, a man throws a ball high in the air and catches it again. He behaves as if he had solved a set of differential equations. And then he adds the second part, at some subconscious level, something functionally equivalent is going on. That's a typical rhetoric that you find in much of psychology. So, how else could it be that the player somehow calculates the trajectory so that he knows where he's running? What else could he do? So we don't know, so we make the as-if conjecture. What I will do now with you, I'll give you an example about how actual players solve this problem. And it has nothing to do with something functionally equivalent or whatever this term means. First, let me go on with the as-if. So have you ever calculated a trajectory of a ball? Here it is. You've seen some of these formulas before because there was some multitasking going on the podium. So that's even a constraint because it doesn't have wind, the direction of the wind, the speed of the wind, and spin. It's simplified. Yeah. You could consider it as a kind of optimization on the constraints of the human. And so, and the problem is not the calculation, as it's often said, it's the estimation. Yeah. So you may know g, but you have to estimate the initial angle, that's alpha, and the initial velocity, and so on. How does an actual baseball player know where to run? Just like Friedman's billiard player knows how to do it. A number of experiments show that players don't do anything similar to calculating a trajectory. They rely on a set of simple heuristics. I'll just explain the simplest one, which works when the ball is already high up in the air. We call this the Gaze Heuristic. It has 3 steps. First, fixate your eye on the ball. Second, start running. Third, adjust your running speed so that the angle of gaze remains constant. You make it linear. The player here does exactly this. He's running in a way so that the angle of gaze remains constant, and then he's there where the ball is coming down. Would you like to see it again? The important thing here is that the player can get away without calculating or estimating any of the variables you have seen in the equation, including those which were not there. And the heuristic focuses on only one variable, which is the angle of gaze. That's all. It's an instance of a larger class of heuristics, which we call one-reason decision-making. The one reason does the job. This heuristic doesn't come out of the blue. Many animal species use the same heuristic when intercepting prey in 3-dimensional space, air or water, or intercepting mates. And for many, there's not much difference. So, so here is an evolutionary basis for this type of heuristic, and it needs a number of cognitive capacities that need to be built in. For instance, the ability to keep your eye on a moving target against a noisy background, which is still today, there's no computer, no robot who can do this as well as a human being. Now, having identified a heuristic, a neoclassical economist might say, that's nice that you understand how it's being done, but it's not really important because we just want to predict behavior. We don't want to know what's going on in the brain. That would be a standard rhetoric. Now, what I do now, I use this example to show that if you have a good model of the heuristic, then you can make predictions about behavior that differ from the as-if model. and I'll just show you a few. So first, to start with, the player's goal appears different. In terms of the as-if model, so computing the trajectory, it's to determine the landing point. The heuristic, that's not the goal. If you understand the heuristic, the goal is to intercept the ball. This is a different goal. And here are three predictions. The as-if model would say the player runs to a landing point and waits to catch the ball, in order to correct for maybe errors of calculation. That's not what you see. The Gaze heuristic predicts the player will intercept the ball while running, because he or she has to move all the time to make the angle constant. And that's what the empirical evidence is. The mark is the empirical evidence. Second prediction, the as-if model would suggest players run in a straight line. No. You can derive from the heuristic situations where players run in a slight arc. And it's not an irrationality. That's how it's been solved. And third prediction, the player would know where the ball is landing, and actually, as you now understand, someone who uses the heuristic doesn't need to know where the ball is landing, and actual experiments show that experienced players are not very good in estimating. A heuristic uses less effort in information search. Therefore, the argument is you lose something in accuracy. This is the most widespread vision about heuristic. It is wrong. You just saw an example. With the Gaze heuristic, you can ignore all of these things, and you make safer decisions, faster decisions, and more accurate decisions. And there is no danger of miscalculating, misestimating there. The second widespread error is that we rely on heuristics only because of our cognitive limitations. We do have cognitive limitations, but any one of you who has ever read Luria's account, the Russian psychologist, of Shereshevsky, the man who apparently had no cognitive limitation in his memory, you don't want to become Shereshevsky. Because the man could really reconstruct, according to Luria, every day of his life, every detail, but the thing he could not do, he was overwhelmed with all the details. He had difficulties in abstracting, in generalizing, in finding the gist, in analogy and other things. So there is a reason why we have these limitations. And as you will see today, they provide some of the biases that we need in order to make better decisions. So what I will do, I will turn around the heuristics and bias argument today. And usually the argument is, we make errors because we have these heuristics. The argument today is that we make better decisions because we have these biases. We'll get to this. And the third misconception is heuristic decisions are unconscious and error-prone. This is I think it was mentioned before, the system 1, system 2 distinction, which aligns heuristics with unconscious and with error-prone, as opposed to logic or probability theory with deliberate, and apparently you never make errors with that. Don't believe in this philosophy. Two remarks. First, as you just have seen, the same heuristic, the Gaze heuristic, can be used unconsciously, the baseball player. And if you ever interview a baseball player, how they do what they do, you get, it's intuitive. And that's the definition of intuition. And the same heuristic that underlies intuition can be used deliberately. There's no difference. There are not two processes. The same process can be used deliberately and unconsciously, and also the alignment with errors is plainly wrong. And what bothers me most about this movement is usually science progresses from dichotomies to precise models. This is one of the very few instances where it goes backwards. We have precise models of heuristics, and now we just throw everything away into a dichotomy of a system 1 and a system 2, a fast one and a slow one, aligned with some other things. All the modeling is gone. By the way, Herbert Simon said the same, something very similar. It's a fallacy to contrast analytic and intuitive styles of management. I just found this recently. I didn't know it. I had written a book on gut feelings, arguing that intuition is based on the same heuristics as deliberate thing, but he knew it earlier. So this was an example of a heuristic, and the lesson is that we can model heuristics, we can derive predictions from these, and as you will see there's an entire mathematics that we can use, like lexicographic structures. There is no need now to turn everything into an optimization model and miss the real processes. And now I want to ask a challenging question. Can heuristics be normative? According to the Kahneman-Tversky program, the answer is clearly no. The question never emerged, because heuristics are always second best. And logic and probability theory is always the best. Again, this is a total misunderstanding that holds for a world of known risk, but not for a world of uncertainty. So we have worked on a way to understand what Herbert Simon called a pair of scissors. That's a famous quote of him, where he's saying human rational behavior is shaped by a scissors whose two blades are the structure of the task environment and the computational capabilities of the actor. So it's about rational behavior. And what we have added to Herbert Simon's perspective or worked out is not just the first question, so how can we model how people make decisions when there's uncertainty, but also a normative account of this. And what has puzzled us for some time is how can we work out the pair of scissors? And I go with you through a few steps we went through. So very early, Peter Todd and I defined, we had the concept of ecologic rationality. You understand why? Because the two systems is not one here, one there. It's the mind and the environment. So rationality is not logical. It's ecological. So modus ponens, or first order logic, or base rule are not rational per se. They're only rational in certain situations, and we need to work them out. So a heuristic is ecologically rational to the degree that is adapted to the structure of environment. Vernon Smith took this in his Nobel speech and extended it to markets and organizations. Herb sent us a very nice comment saying that the models that we worked out, they brought sanity in the study of rationality. But what does it really mean? Can we formalize that? And here's the first attempt we tried to do. Here are two heuristics. Tallying is very easy. If you think about a regression equation, throw away all weights. Just add up, tally. So if you want to marry someone, if you're men, there are two women, and if you would tally, you would list all the things that you would like, and then count them up. That's tallying. How did you do it? Most people do it by intuition. The idea, what I call, could the scissors be mirrors? Is the relationship between mind and environment just a mirror? Is tallying is rational relative to any other linear model if the weights of the cues, like the properties of the desired objects, if they're all the same, and tallying ignores weights. So that sounds quite simple and direct. A little bit more tricky is, and Laura Martineau and Ulrich Hoffer worked out the proofs for that, take the best, it's a lexicographic heuristic. You go through a number of reasons, you stop the first time, it allows, so the two objects differ, and we could prove that if the cues in the world are non-compensatory, like 1, a half, the weights of the cues, a quarter, and so on, then there's no linear model that can ever be more accurate then the simple take the best, which just goes with one reason. And you can see that because if take the best steps with the first one, even if all the other cues that it doesn't look up point to the other object, they don't add up to more. So this was the beginning. But at this beginning, we were trying to define Herbert-Simon sisters by this kind of mirror image. And these proofs are true for a world where you don't have to do estimates. The moment you have to estimate, there's more. And the more, and since I'm not doing much math here, I just try to explain the principle. The second way of scissors is as a bias-variance trade-off. What is this? It's the insight from statistical theory that the total error that you commit in a judgment, is not just the bias. So the difference between the bias is the difference between the true state and your average prediction of your model. But there is something else as variance. That's the flexibility of the model. That means if you have many samples, your model always gives a different value, particularly if it's many free parameters. And the variance around this is the second source of error. Let me try to explain this with a very simple example. Assume, so what you see here is the temperature in London. Every point is the average temperature, 365 days. You take samples of these and fit a degree 12 polynomial and a degree 3 polynomial. So green is the degree 3. What is a polynomial? A polynomial is of first degree is a line. Second degree is a parabola. Third one is something like a parabola that comes back. You need at least a third degree because otherwise next year will never be warm again. And what you see here is that the flexible one, the 12 degree polynomial, has a much better fit. It can go. And in the extreme, if you would have a polynomial of 365 degrees, you could go through each point with a perfect fit. And by that, you see already that fitting doesn't mean much. Here are the polynomials and the error, and lower is better. And a polynomial of first degree, a line is not very good, has more errors. And what do you see? The more complex the model, the better the fit. And we still have disciplines, like much of sociology, almost all of education, much of psychology, and parts of economics who stop here and report a great fit. This is not a good test of a model. Now a question for you. If we take each of these models and predict next year's temperature, or from a sample the entire, of how will the curve look like? That's an important question. Again, we have fitted each polynomial, a simple one, a complex ones, to samples of data. And now we predict, say, next year's data, or we predict from the sample the entire year. That is not much different. How will the error be? And particular, so make it simple. First question is, will the curve for prediction be above or below the red curve? Who thinks it's above? Who thinks it's below? Nobody thinks anything. You have to do your part in this talk. Again, so error is up here. If you make more error with prediction, then you must be there. If prediction is easier, it must be here. Who thinks it will be down here? Nobody? One. Who thinks it's up here? Two. The majority is right, as usual. And if you're socially smart, you could have used a simple heuristic. Yeah? Gerd left more space up here. Of course, it's there. Sorry. But the important question is, what shape? Why is this important? Because if in prediction, now in estimation, the same relation holds that more is always better. Does it hold or does it not hold? Could it be that the best fitting models are not the best ones in prediction? How does the curve look like? Is it going up, down? Can I ask Herb's daughter? He didn't tell you. So, have you any idea? Going up. That's half true. So we are now doing, just to make clear, we take every of this model, that's a degree 1 polynomial, degree 2 polynomial, and these are more complex, just more free, add a free parameter for each of them, and which we fixed, and now we predict, say, next year's temperature. How will the error curve be? Will it still be that the more complex is better? Yeah.
It's not going to be very stable when you go to a higher degree of polynomial.
Yeah.
The curve will vary much more from year to year than a low degree polynomial.
Yeah.
So while the explanatory power is less, it's so dependent on the particular year's data you use that that's not really hard.
Okay. These, what is done here, you take 1 year precisely, you take samples of 30 days, an infinite number of samples of 30 days, and then see how they predict. And basically what you wanted to say, Shyam, is the following, that it's, when it gets complex, it is going up again. Did I get this right? Yeah. Yeah. It's a U-shaped curve. That means, and that's now the interesting point to understand. This is a model, this is a line, a straight line. That's not a good model of temperature. It has a strong bias. And here, a degree polynomial is something that is not coming back. It's also not a good one. It has also a strong bias. These models here, the more complex, the lower the bias is going. A neural network model has almost no bias. But they are very sensitive to the samples. And they incur what's called variance. So here we have a situation, in other words, a kind of stubbornness here hurts a bit, but being totally flexible to your sample, then you totally overfit all of this, and you are worse off with a strong bias. And what you also see, we need something in between. We need a little bit bias and not too flexible. So I'll skip these two. This is the bias variance decomposition. I'll just show you here, that's the polynomial of 1 degree, and almost all error is bias. And in this example, it's assumed that the true underlying structure is a polynomial 3rd degree. From here on, bias is 0. But variance increases and increases. It gets more flexible, it gets more dependent on whatever idiosyncrasies is. So here is the basic insight. When we have to predict something and don't know everything, we need a certain kind of bias, but also a certain kind of flexibility to learn. And this is the dilemma. Bias is not something we should get rid of. It's something that needs, and it needs to be chosen. And here are 3 ways to introduce bias. One is, and I will go through them, you just ignore all weights. It's called 1 over n of reasons. That's like tallying. Or one uses a heuristic that has just one reason. That's like the Gaze Heuristic or Lexicographic Heuristics. Here one ignores the dependency between reasons. And I will show you, even if in the real world there is a dependency, you can do better by ignoring it, not trying to estimate it. So you avoid the other error. So, are you ready? Now we're getting into some examples. First, equal weights. I will now go, the rest of the talk is about three types to introduce bias in order to make better inferences. Let's assume an investment situation. You have a certain number of money left despite the crisis, you want to invest it. And you don't want to put everything in the one pot, you want to diversify, but how? So how do you weigh or distribute your money? Harry Markowitz from the University of Chicago has gotten his Nobel Prize for the solution. It's the mean variance model. Up there is the mean, down there's the variance and the covariances. When Harry Markowitz made his own investment for the time after his retirement, he used his Nobel Prize winning optimization method, so we might think he did not. He used a simple heuristic called 1/n. That means distribute your money equally. So, a number of researchers, among others de Miguel, have asked the question, how good is this heuristic in investment? Again, note, the Markowitz model is optimal if the assumptions hold of the model and the parameters can be estimated without errors. None of this holds. So it will incur both bias and variance. How does one study this? And important is, in our study, we always study comparatively. So a heuristic against someone else, rather than having just an optimization model and say, oh, great, big R square, we won. So in this study, there were a number of investment problems. One of them was you invest in 10 American industrial stocks, and the Markowitz model needs to estimate its parameter from earlier data. It got 10 years of data to estimate next month's performance, and then the window was moved by a month, and with this 10 years, you estimated the next month's performance and so on until you ran out of data. 1/n doesn't need any data. It has no free parameters. It's absolute bias. What was the result? In 6 out of the 7 problems being tested, 1/n made more money than Markowitz, according to standard criteria like Sharpe ratio. How can that be? How can simple be more? And note that 1/n ignores all of the data. The answer is in the bias variance dilemma. 1/n has probably a strong bias, but it has no variance. So it will always give the same allocation, whatever sample it has. It's not sensitive to the idiosyncrasies of samples. And Markowitz has a bias and has variance. So the real question is, when will the sum of the two be smaller than the bias that 1/n has? And one can do simulations on that. And the key features are here. That's the ecological rationality question. If there's low uncertainty, make it complex, mean variance. But the stock market has high uncertainty. If there are few alternatives, so n, then it speaks in favor of mean variance, because it doesn't have to do so many parameter estimate, and if there's a high amount of data. Otherwise, make it simple. This is now non-quantitative, that's just qualitative. Now you can do computer simulations and ask how much data would you need if you fix the alternatives, say to 50 alternatives, how many years of stock market data would you need so that mean variance will become better than 1/n? Remember, 10 years is too little. What's your guess? You need more. 11? 12? 500. Yeah? That's exactly the estimate. Yeah? Here's an informed person. That means in the year 2500, yeah, people can stop relying on their intuitions, like 1/n, and doing the calculations, provided that the same stocks are still around in the stock market in the first place. Do our banks understand that or want to understand that? I'll show you a letter I got from my own bank in Berlin. Have you learned from your father German? Did he taught you, so you can read it. I'm glad. So I translate. That's the internet bank. It says, with Nobel Prize winning strategy towards success in investment. And then the question was, do you know Harry Markowitz? No, but you should. And then explained that he won the Nobel Prize in economics. The bank is now adopting the methods. And there's a warning later on your own intuitions. What this bank has not understood is that they sent the letter 500 years too early. A remark on the last crisis. There are many factors who led to this crisis. One is the type of mathematical models that are used to estimate, for instance, the capital a bank needs, like value at risk. These models are the same type as the Markowitz models, and they're all made for a world of known risk, but they fail in a world of uncertainty. And here we have an example where rational models are part of the problem, not the solution. They suggest an illusion of certainty which is not there. I work with the Bank of England on a project that's called Simple Heuristics for a Safer World. And if you're interested in that, I won't go in this, then look up Andy Haldanes. He's the Director of Financial Stability. Jackson Hole Talk, which was named by the Harvard Business Review as the speech of the year. And if you read the title of this talk, you know where he got the ideas from. So, now let me go back to Herbert Simon. Another important statement that he made is that the apparent complexity of human behavior is to a large degree due to the environment and not to complex rules people use. I'll give you one example from our research. Who of you has 2 or more children? Yeah. Okay. How do you distribute your love, your time among your children? Do you do computations? Gary Becker has a wonderful maximization models where you might find out who of your children will later support you, will make more money, and do the maximization question. Very few parents do that. Or is there anyone here who has done this? How do you do it? That's the process question again. And many parents rely on the same heuristic that we just talked about, 1/n. So divide your time equally. And the interesting point is here, and now we go back to Simon's system, the outcome is not determined just by your heuristic, but the environment also determines it. You see that here. This is from a large study on how American parents divide up the time. This is basically an index for a number of hours these parents have spent. Now look at families with 2 children. These are here. And what you see, it's basically the same. They get equal time. But what happens if you have 3 children? So this is the spacing. So these 3 children are on average 1 year apart. Here they are 2 years apart and so on. You see, the first and the last one gets most, and the middle one gets less. The same if there are 2 years around. The same if there are 3 years, and so on. Now, if you would be a person that doesn't know about Simon's scissors, but does the usual psychology about attitudes, about traits, you might conclude that parents really don't like their middleborns. Are there middleborns here? Any middleborn? Do you have this experience that your parents don't like you as much as... So it's puzzling. So one might explain that by some kind of bias in favor of the firstborn or the lastborn. You can always make stories about that. The point is that this effect is implied by this simple heuristic. How? Now, the firstborn, unless the 3 are twins or triples, the firstborn has a time for him or herself, gets everything. Then the second one comes, and they're divided equally. And then, at the end, both drop out. and the last one has also time for himself. So at the end, 1 over n leads in a triple family to exactly this phenomenon. And the larger the spacing is, the more extreme is. You can derive all these results that you see, these are empirical results, from this simple heuristic. And if you add this up to 4 children, families with 4 children, you get the entire pattern out of it. So that's an illustration that a simple heuristic, and it has no free parameters, you can deduce the consequences for 2 environmental variables, number of children and the spacing between children. And you get all this injustice out that some of you have suffered. So this is an illustration to the second one. Now let me go to the second way to introduce a bias. The first one was you just ignore all weights. And the second one is one reason heuristics. The Gaze heuristic is an example. Instead of looking at all reasons, you just look at one, a good one. The example I give you here is from management. So assume you own a company that has 100,000 of customers, and you send catalogs, messages, information, big deals, and that costs time and money, and you don't want to target customers who will never buy again with you. So inactive customers, you want to target those who are active. How can you tell them apart? That's the question. And it's again a decision under high uncertainty. You don't know what they do, why they wouldn't buy. The management theory, and again 2 ways. One is use an optimization model for this problem in an uncertain world. And it's the Pareto negative binomial distribution model, which has 4 free parameters. I'm not going into this model. And the other way is what many managers actually do. And according to this study I'll show you, many managers use the hiatus heuristic. So in this case, for instance, if a customer hasn't bought for 9 months, out, otherwise in. Frequent flyer programs do this with you. Note that this simple heuristic ignores most of the information that the Pareto negative binomial distribution model has and doesn't do any computation. What do the studies show? Here is the first study with an airline, and here are the correct predictions whether a customer bought or didn't buy. The simple heuristic predicts slightly better than the optimization model. In an apparel business, the difference is larger, and in the CD, internet business, it's the same. At least you save the time and the effort. Here's another example where the bias built in. Now the bias is here that you just rely on one reason. You forget the rest. And try not estimate all of the other parameters. Pays out in order to make better inferences. Last way to introduce a bias is lexicographic heuristics. What is this? Lexicographic heuristic orders cues like take the best we saw before and makes a decision, say, between which of 2 options you want to buy or which is bigger by just relying on the best cue, on the first cue that allows a difference. This is something very different than adding and weighing. And we have good empirical evidence that in many situations people make decisions in a lexicographic way rather than by weighing and adding of all this. And particularly we have good evidence that in situations where this lexicographic strategy are ecologic rational, more people do that. Nevertheless, despite all this evidence, there's a group of people who still think that it must something be wrong with it. And this are some quotes from Keeney and Reifers' book, where you see if anything is not weighing and adding or not doesn't look like expected utility theory, it can't be good. That's the conclusion. And the end will rarely pass a test of reasonableness. They don't provide anyone because they know already. We did. And I show you here the average result over 20 studies we did, they're all of this kind, which of two objects has a higher value on a criterion, like which of two Chicago schools have higher dropout rates, which they don't publish, you have to infer them from other things. And the important thing here is, this is take the best a lexicographic strategy, that's telling, that is just all reasons are get equal weight. That's the optimization model here, a linear model, multiple regression. And here we have a heuristic that has a too big bias. So it's on the other side of the curve. It just picks some reason randomly. The important result is in data fitting, when we know everything, then complex pays. It does better. But see this crossover. This is now fitted on half of the data, prediction on the other half, and then suddenly both ways to introduce bias, namely just go with one reason or ignore all weights, do on average better than multiple regression. When we first published these results, the echo was, it can't be true. You can't tell me that with one reason that's in the regression, you could do better than with all of them. Now, I think many people realize that, and we have tested nonlinear model, vector machines, and other machines that all create high variance error. And the point is, the real question is, when does simple pay and when not? And let me go towards my end. There is just an announcement. There will be a talk by Konstantinos Katsikopoulos on the priority heuristic, which is also a simple lexicographic heuristic, which implies an amazing range of so-called anomalies, now in a world of risk, for which so far the models like prospect theory, cumulative prospect theory have been developed. The idea is, as always, you have a problem and a complex model, and it doesn't work. What do? You make it more complex, add more parameters, and then you get these models. What I show here is what you will hear in his talk. This model has 0 free parameters. It logically implies this phenomena, unlike prospect theory, which needs new constellations of parameters in order to fit them after the fact. And the last thing I'll show you is another type of lexicographic strategy, which also has the bias built in by ignoring, when one orders the cues, the dependencies between cues are ignored. And the interesting thing is, even if there are dependencies, these models can do better than trying to estimate them, because they don't overfit here. The left example is one that was developed based on our research in a Michigan hospital to diagnose people who come in with suspicion of a heart attack, and the doctors need to make a decision whether to send the person into the coronary care unit or regular bed. So that's the care unit, regular bed. Only 3 questions are asked. So whether there is a change in the ST segment, it's the electrocardiogram. If yes, immediately in the coronary care unit. Otherwise, if the chief complaint are chest pains, if no, then in a regular bed, and whether any of these factors dies. A study showed that the simple model predicts better than a logistic regression with more of these parameters. And again, the reason I think you understand now is because there's a bias built in. And the bias does part of the work. So, let me get to the end. What we are trying to do is to develop Herbert Simon's vision of bounded rationality as the study of the actual processes with which people deal with an uncertain world. And there are 3 questions. What's in the adaptive toolbox? That's a descriptive question. So what are the heuristics? What are the building blocks? And what are the capacities that work? And the second question is a normative question. Can we specify the structures of environments in which a certain heuristic is better than another strategy, say a complex one? And the bias variance dilemma is one way to go with this, and we are pursuing others. And that's also very important because it puts heuristics on the same levels as so-called Bayes or other models, where we ask, yeah, which one is better, instead of having preconceptions and calling some model optimal or normal or rational. There is nothing, yeah, that is the best thing for every problem. That's a big error. And finally, we use these results in order to help people making better decisions, as you have seen in the example with the doctors. So, let me end with a simple heuristic, which is, when I was puzzled what exactly Herb Simon means with bounded rationality, what's the difference to satisficing, I sent Herbert a letter and asked him, and here's his answer. The answer is in his typical modesty, basically saying that, yeah, he hasn't thought of these terms as precisely defined technical terms, but it's a sign to do a different kind of science. And I think if Herb could sit here this evening, he would probably say the same thing, that we are at the beginning of another revolution. We had in the 17th century the probabilistic revolution. It has changed the world. It had to wait until the 20th century, until it reached economics and psychology, but we know we have a powerful tool, probability theory, but it's not the only one. We need a second revolution, call it the heuristic revolution. Tools that are able to deal with an uncertain world, that answer Simon's question. And heuristics are one of these tools to do this. And so, if he would sit here, I think he would still say the same thing. We are still somewhere at the beginning. But I hope he would also be pleased with some of the progress made in terms of formal models of heuristics, the amount of empirical evidence we have today, and the predicted and documented counterintuitive results that less information can be more. And actually we understand now why this is, and we have formalized his scissors analogy in terms of ecological rationality. And I would like at the end to thank Herb for the inspiration he gave to all of us. Thank you very much.